Hi. So, I was thinking of other content, trying to think of other content, and my wife suggested, most recently in the comments, that I should get to some of her list that she made for me. She made a list of some things that I could share or talk about. And so I'm starting to do that here. One of them was talking about history of punk music and especially specifically Christian punk music. But I thought before I dive into something like that, I might just give a little bit of my background musically, or in essence, my musical history, so that you can see that, yeah, I didn't just totally grow up with this stuff. I know at one point when I was in high school, folks were like, man, you know all this music and stuff. And it wasn't like it was something that I had just always listened to, as you'll see. So I decided I was starting to kind of list out significant either albums or songs from growing up, and before I knew it, the list was getting quite long. So this is probably going to be divided up into a couple of different videos. So this first one, we're just going to start out with, see how it goes, talking about my early years from childhood to preteen. Some of these were just images of albums that I just remember having for as long as I could remember, being alive, being around. And so, I'll just share in there, and there were really only about, as I made sort of this list, I went through and looked, and there was really only about 5 Christian specifically albums or music that kind of stuck out during that time. And this would be from like little kid as early as I can remember up to about preteen years, and getting to about 11 years old or so is where I kind of stopped this first chunk. Because then, of course, as everybody knows, once you get in middle school, junior high, and then high school, if you're into music, it kind of blows up. But I'll just start out. So 2 of the first albums I ever remember having, I don't remember us getting them, but I remember having them. Naturally, a lot of my early music was soundtracks. And of course, the 2 that I remember the most from back then were the Star Wars soundtrack, the original John Williams orchestration there, and the Superman the movie soundtrack from 77 and 1978. And just to date this whole thing, they were both actually on 8-track cassette. So those were the first sort of things that I remember having. And then I had a little record player, and I could play all kinds of different records. And so I'm sure a lot of these early ones were stuff that my parents had that I took a liking to, but we'll just go with it and see how this rolls. So other than the Star Wars soundtrack, I also had the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, all those great Bee Gees tunes, and I especially remember loving the kind of classical influence, like the Fifth of Beethoven, and the one that kind of had that Valkyrie sort of sound. But those were really cool. Of course, I think it was issued to you if you were born or grew up in the 70s, The Gambler by Kenny Rogers. We had a copy of YMCA by the Village People. And this was an odd one, but I've just always remembered growing up with this song, Werewolves of London by Warren Zevon. And for the very adventurous, the B-side of that album was very interesting. A song called Roland, the Headless Thompson Gunner. Then in 1979, the Heartache Tonight by the Eagles. I I had Another One Bites the Dust by Queen, and the B-side, Don't Try Suicide. And in 1980, I also probably near about wore out this LP, the Oak Ridge Boys Greatest Hits. Now, this Greatest Hits album was before they had released the single, and so I had this as a separate single, but the classic Elvira by the Oak Ridge Boys. Also, I remember having this album as long as I can remember. 1980s Pat Benetar, Hit Me With Your Best Shot. Also had no clue where it came from, but I had Da Do 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 Da 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 by the Police, 1980. As you can see, as we go through this list, it's going to be quite a diverse group of songs. Now, this I didn't actually have the album for, because as a child, I did not have the really ability to research and figure out, oh, that sounds really cool. What is that? But I just remember loving dropping that quarter into the arcade cabinet and hearing do 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 do. I later learned that was the Peter Gunn theme. It was used in the Blues Brothers movie and a lot of other places, but for me, it was the Spy Hunter song from the Spy Hunter arcade cabinet. So it was rocking. I love that thing. Of course, Celebration by Kool and the Gang. The theme from the Dukes of Hazzard by Waylon Jennings. I Love a Rainy Night by Eddie Rabbitt. And then later in 81, Step by Step by Eddie Rabbitt. Also, I was a kid. I had the Smurfs All-Star Show. It was a bunch of Smurf version songs. Popular hits and things. The one I remember the most was Smurfin' USA instead of Surfin' USA. I Love Rock and Roll by Joan, Jett, and the Blackhearts. Queen of Hearts by Juice Newton from 81. We Got the Beat by the Go-Go's. And then in 1983, started to grow into some of the things that I don't just remember them and just remember having them, but I remember actually these were some things that I got or that I wanted that came out while I was a kid. Beat It by Michael Jackson. Once again, growing up, child of the 80s, it was pretty much issued to you. I mean, Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper. And then, this was quite unusual, but me, I really liked things that sounded techno or sounded like robotic or sci-fi or all that sort of stuff. I was still on the Star Wars craze, I guess you will. And I had the album, the Pointer Sisters Breakout from 1983, and there were 3 songs on that album that I liked. One, I'm So Excited. Jump, For My Love, not to be confused with Jump from Van Halen 1984. And then the one that I really had this album for, I loved Neutron Dance. I had seen the Walt Disney World Electric Main Street Parade, and they had played this song in the soundtrack of the parade, Neutron Dance, and so it just like the electric lights and the color and the everything, and it was just like powerful. Around this time of 1983, this album came out, but I don't remember listening to it until much later. It was one of the Kids Praise collections, and it included Salty, the Singing Songbook. Salt spelled like a psalter or the Psalms in the Bible, Psalty. And this was Kids Praise Volume 4, Sensational Servants cassette. A lot of folks will know this one because if you've ever had like a puppet ministry in your church, there's a song on there called Draw Me Nearer, an old gospel tune, and it's just really hammed up, really supremely by a character in the drama known as Charity Church Mouse. And she does this song, and it's just great for puppets because they can just act wild and do it. Okay, so that was one of the first albums I remember of Christian music specifically. I also had the Prince Purple Rain soundtrack. My favorites in order of preference were Let's Go Crazy, then When Doves Cry, and then finally Purple Rain, but it was kind of a snooze for me at that age. Also, I was really coming into my own of liking music about the same time that hip hop and the break dancing and everything was popular. I even remember in our elementary PE class, our teacher allowed us to kind of choreograph our own little dances and kind of music videos in essence. So in that interest, I had the Beat Street movie soundtrack. I loved Beat Street Breakdown. Great early rap tune there. I had the 7-inch vinyl single version from 1984 of Jam On It by Nucleus, Newcleus. I had New Edition's single for Lost in Love. And once again, one of those techno-sounding sort of songs, I liked Operator by Midnight Star from 1984. Now, of course, not straying too far from the soundtrack formula, I had Ghostbusters by Ray Parker Jr., Ghostbusters movie theme, of course. In 1984, a children's musical came out that I played a big part in a couple of times growing up in church called Angels Aware. And it was different than anything I had heard up till then. And so it was it impacted me quite a bit. But it was great. It was by the famous children's music maker Kathy Hill, who's more famous for Down by the Creek Bank and some of those things. But anyway, there was Like a Virgin by Madonna in 1984, Mississippi Squirrel Revival by Ray Stevens, parody, of course, Eat It by Weird Al Yankovic. And I remember this also as being one of the first music videos that I saw. One of my parents' friends had MTV, and I saw Wild Boys by Duran Duran. Rounding out some of the soundtracks, I had the Footloose soundtrack. I had Snoopy Flash Beagle soundtrack. In 85, I had the Goonies soundtrack. I had the Iron Eagle soundtrack, Top Gun soundtrack. Anybody seeing a trend here? I also had the single for One Night in Bangkok by Murray Head from 1984. In 1985, we did another children's musical called Amazing Grace, children celebrating the grace of God. And that was another that left an impression on me. That one was so popular, we actually took our show on the road and went to other neighboring churches. And then in 1985, this album came out, but I don't really remember listening to it and enjoying it until we were living in Florida and my mother was working with the youth there at our church. It was Amy Grant's Unguarded. And I had never heard anything quite like that, and it was rocking and it was awesome. In 86, I remember we had the cassette of, and my mother loved Sandy Patty, so we had the cassette of A Morning Like This, and so many great songs on that album. And so those were a couple of my first real, not children's musical or otherwise, sort of Christian music albums, if you will. Then just to finish out, to close it out, I also had the Fat Boys version of Wipeout from 1987. Little did I know I would later kind of backtrack and fall in love with the Beatles, but I had the LP of Got My Mind Set on You by George Harrison from 1987. And then to kind of round out my Michael Jackson, because I had a bunch of Michael Jackson things, had Thriller album, but Bad from 1987 kind of brings a good close to that childhood phase and move into the next time that I get to do something like this. We'll talk about my preteen and teenager years or early youth group years. So anyway, if some of those strike a chord with you, something you'd be interested in, and maybe something you might not have heard before. I'm going to try to add as much of this as I can to the description, and if it won't fit there, I'll add it to the comments. But please subscribe, like, all that sort of stuff, and we'll keep rolling with some music content a little bit, try to vary things up for a little bit. So, till next time.